Next up is a section titled Model Results. In this section you have 5 columns. In the first column, you get information about what it is the numbers refer to. So for example, in this line here, you get the regression coefficient from perceived parenting competence to child externalizing problems. And in this line here, you will also get a regression coefficient, but this time from conflict to perceived parenting competence. In the second column here, you get the actual estimated parameter for the thing you are measuring. So for example, all of these numbers here refer to regression coefficients. And these numbers are intercepts for the regression equation, and these are the residual variances. Do you know what a residual variance is? Have a little think, you might remember, you might have seen it somewhere else before. Right, so a residual variance is the amount of variance left unexplained by the predictors. In this column here, you have the standard error that accompanies each of these estimates. And in this column here, you have literally the estimate divided by the standard error. So if you took, say, for example, this number here, and then you divided it by this number here, you would get this. Finally, in this column here, you get the p-value. Now, one thing people don't usually know is that the p-value here is not associated with the actual estimate. In fact, it is associated to this score here. This acts like a z-test. So in fact, if you have, for example, a small sample, you might very well have large regression coefficients, but you will very likely have very big standard errors, which will make this coefficient be quite small, and therefore maybe give you a non-significant p-value, for example. So that's something to keep in mind. So this section here represented the unstandardized solution. It's usually useful to look at the standardized results because it's much easier to interpret coefficients there. So let's scroll down and have a look. So we've reached the standardized results section. Here you get exactly the same stuff that you got before, but everything is now standardized. So now you can look at these regression coefficients and you will know that they are betas. And they can go from -1 to +1. So as an exercise, why don't you try and write out a few sentences about what you think happened here in terms of our results regarding the pathways in our diagram. If you were to summarize this just in English, how would the story go? So I would say that child externalizing problems was more influenced by perceived parenting competence and maybe a little bit by stress, but not by conflict. And I would also say that perceived parenting competence was not influenced by conflict, but was influenced by stress. What do you think these two numbers here would suggest? So this number here refers to the amount of variance in perceived parenting competence left unexplained by stress and conflict. And it's quite big, so 95.6% is left over. And this number here tells us a similar story, which is that 91.7% of variance in child externalizing problems was not explained by the 3 predictors: conflict, stress, and perceived parenting competence. You can get a similar bit of information from the R-square here. What is the R-square? Have you seen it before? If so, take a moment to try to interpret what these two coefficients mean. So the R-square refers to the proportion of variance that was explained. In fact, it is the exact opposite of that. So if you look at the standardized residual variance and the R-square, the corresponding numbers should add to 1. if you have a total variance of 1, so 100% of the variance in parenting, and you see that 95.6% was left unexplained, then you get, of course, that 4.4% was. And similarly, for child externalizing problems, we had 8% of variance that was explained, and roughly 92% that was left over. So like I said, if you add these two numbers up, you will see they add up to 1, the total variance. If you scroll down a bit more, you will get the total indirect, specific indirect, and direct effects. So this is where you get your indirect effects, and like with your usual coefficients, they come in different flavors. The first section here refers to unstandardized results, and underneath you will also get the standardized solution because you asked Mplus to give you that. When we look at the coefficients, you see that the indirect effect from stress to child externalizing problems via perceived parenting competence was significant, but the indirect effect from conflict was not significant. This makes sense when you scroll up to the results. Let's take the standardized solution, and you notice that the effect from conflict to perceived parenting competence was itself not significant. So one of the two parts of mediation was not significant, and of course then it makes sense that the actual indirect effect was also not significant. When you scroll down further, you start to see the confidence intervals.